James Turner, the first black sheriff of Lakeside, drove down the lonely stretch of road, unaware that he was moments away from a nightmare. No warning signs, no clues in the air, just the darkening horizon ahead. Who could have guessed that soon he'd be caught in a brutal struggle, not just for survival, but against those he trusted most? What he was about to face would defy belief and leave scars deeper than any wound. Hold on tight, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Subscribe now for stories of courage and justice that you won't want to miss. Out of nowhere, a car roared past, swerving wildly as it shot into Turner's lane, its tires shrieking against the pavement. Turner's heartbeat pounded in his chest as he gripped the wheel, his car skidding slightly as he braked hard. "What the?" His voice trailed off, eyes fixed on the taillights of the speeding car cutting recklessly from side to side. He could have ignored it, let them pass into the night. But he was the sheriff, this was his duty, his town to protect. Even without his badge on display, Turner's responsibility ran deep. He pressed down on the gas, his car surging forward, lights flashing. This driver was a menace. As he closed in on the car, Turner's eyes narrowed in disbelief. 2 men in uniform were in the front seats. The horrifying thought crossed his mind, these weren't just reckless strangers, they were officers. As Turner pulled up behind them, his sheriff's lights flashing, the other car lurched to a stop, gravel spraying across the darkened road. The scene fell eerily quiet as Turner stepped out of his vehicle, boots crunching against the rocky shoulder. He watched as the doors of the other car swung open, revealing 2 men in uniform, both clearly annoyed, a flicker of something close to amusement passing between them. Turner's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The last thing he'd expected tonight was to be dealing with 2 officers acting so recklessly. The men sauntered over, their body language radiating arrogance. Turner's stomach twisted as he recognized that look, the subtle dismissal, the way they assessed him as if he were beneath them. He'd seen it before, in the eyes of men who thought respect was a one-way street. But now, it wasn't just disrespect, it was the creeping sense that this could turn dangerous. One of the officers, a tall man with a hardened expression, stepped forward and sneered. "And just who do you think you are?" His tone was mocking, as if he found the situation amusing. Turner's jaw tightened. "Sheriff James Turner," he replied, voice steady and unwavering. "I'd like an explanation for that reckless driving back there." The officers exchanged a knowing glance, both chuckling under their breath. The other officer, shorter but with a similarly smug look, folded his arms and tilted his head with exaggerated patience. "Sheriff, huh?" he drawled, as if the title meant nothing. "Sure you are, and I'm the mayor," he sneered, taking a step closer. Turner kept his composure, though every instinct warned him this was about to escalate. "I'm telling you, I am the sheriff of this town. And you've put lives in danger tonight," he stated firmly. But his words seemed to mean little to the men before him. They didn't budge. In fact, they seemed to grow bolder, leaning into their arrogance. "Well, Sheriff," the tall officer taunted, his voice dripping with contempt, "people like you ought to learn where they belong." The implication was as clear as it was cutting. Turner had faced this kind of insinuation before, but not from within his own ranks. A bitter frustration surged within him, though he worked to keep his face impassive. But then, the tall officer's demeanor shifted. His gaze hardened, and without warning, he took a step forward, shoving Turner square in the chest. Turner staggered back, his boots sliding against the loose gravel. He could hardly believe it. Had one of his own men just assaulted him? He caught himself, his body tense and ready, but he held back, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing him retaliate. "Stand down," Turner commanded, his voice low but firm. "You're making a serious mistake." Yet his authority meant nothing to them. The shorter officer rolled his eyes, scoffing openly. "A mistake?" he mocked. "No, I think the only mistake here is you trying to act like you're in charge." Before Turner could respond, the shorter officer stepped up and shoved him again, harder this time, sending him reeling back. He barely managed to stay upright. The men laughed, the sound cold and cruel against the quiet night. It was becoming clear. They didn't see him as their superior. In their eyes, he was just another man who needed to be put in his place. Turner's patience was running thin, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and disbelief. "I am your sheriff," he stated again, voice strong but with an edge of warning. "I suggest you back off, now." But they weren't listening. As Turner steadied himself from the latest shove, he could feel the tension thickening. His instincts, honed by years on the force, screamed that this was no ordinary confrontation. But this time, it wasn't just the usual verbal jabs or dismissive glances he'd learned to navigate. This was hostility, pure and direct. The two officers stood in front of him, smirking, daring him to retaliate. One of the men, his face hardened with a cruel glint in his eye, tilted his head with mock curiosity. "What's wrong, Sheriff? You look nervous." He emphasized the last word with a sharpness that felt like a taunt, as if trying to provoke Turner to his breaking point. Turner held his ground, fists clenched, willing himself to stay calm. "Enough," Turner said, his voice controlled but cold. "You're crossing a line, both of you. Stand down before this goes any further." But the command only seemed to amuse them more. They exchanged a glance, then one laughed softly, a sound dripping with disdain. Before Turner could react, the tall officer lunged forward, shoving him again, this time with enough force to send him stumbling backward. He barely managed to stay on his feet, but the impact sent a jolt of pain through his side. It wasn't just an act of aggression, it was a calculated display of dominance. Turner's vision narrowed as he processed the situation. He was facing two of his own men, but they didn't see him as their leader, only as a target. "Sheriff, huh?" The shorter officer sneered, circling Turner like a predator. His voice was laced with mockery. "You really think you can order us around? People like you don't get to tell us what to do." Turner's breath caught. The weight of those words was sharp, cutting through any remaining restraint. He knew what they meant, the unspoken threat behind their tone. He steadied himself, the ache in his ribs pulsing with each breath. "This is your last warning. Step back. Now." His voice was firm, but he could feel the simmering anger in his tone. But his command, his authority, it all seemed meaningless to them. Their smirks widened, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of pushing him further. Without warning, the taller officer moved again, this time grabbing Turner by the shoulder and yanking him forward before delivering a brutal punch to his stomach. Turner doubled over, gasping as the pain exploded through his midsection. He struggled to regain his breath, but they weren't giving him a chance. The shorter officer followed suit, shoving Turner hard, sending him sprawling onto the rough gravel. Turner lay there for a moment, the world spinning, gravel digging into his palms as he tried to steady himself. But he felt more than the physical pain. It was the searing humiliation, the realization that these men, his men, saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to crush. As Turner struggled to rise, one of the officers smirked, kicking gravel at him. They didn't just want to hurt him physically, they wanted to strip him of every ounce of dignity. He pushed himself up slowly, his breath ragged, pain shooting through his body with each movement. Yet, even as he staggered to his feet, Turner refused to let them see his fear. He'd faced adversity before, but this was betrayal, and it cut far deeper than any wound. The taller officer snorted, looking at Turner's car parked just a few feet away. "Nice ride, Sheriff," he sneered, crossing his arms with a satisfied smirk. "Would be a shame if something happened to it." Turner's heart sank, his mind racing. His car wasn't just transportation, it was a symbol of everything he'd worked for, everything he'd achieved. He'd saved for years to buy it, a reminder of his resilience, of how far he'd come. And now, in an instant, he realized exactly what they intended. "Don't," Turner gasped, but the words barely escaped his lips before the shorter officer pulled a lighter from his pocket, flipping it open with a flick of his wrist. The flame flared to life, casting an eerie glow over the man's smirk. He looked back at Turner, eyes filled with cruel amusement. "Let's teach the sheriff a lesson he won't forget," he said, his voice dripping with malice. With a quick, almost dismissive gesture, he tossed the lighter toward Turner's car. Time seemed to slow as Turner watched the flame arc through the air, landing near the gas tank. A sickening dread filled him as the fire caught, small at first, then quickly spreading, consuming his car in seconds. Flames licked up the sides, crackling and roaring as they devoured the vehicle. Turner could only watch, frozen, as his car was reduced to an inferno of twisted metal and smoke. The heat from the blaze radiated toward him, sharp and unyielding, reflecting the cold disregard in the officer's eyes. One of them leaned back, arms crossed, as if admiring their handiwork. "Looks like you'll be walking home tonight," he jeered, barely concealing his satisfaction. The shorter officer looked at Turner, his smirk turning to open mockery. "You really thought you were in charge, didn't you?" He laughed, the sound hollow and cruel. Turner's fists clenched involuntarily, but he held his ground. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. But they weren't done yet. As if adding insult to injury, the taller officer sauntered over to Turner, reaching into his pocket to pull out his wallet and phone. "Consider this payment," he sneered, waving the money mockingly before slipping it into his own pocket. The sheer humiliation cut deeper than any physical blow. Turner, sheriff of this town, a man who dedicated his life to justice, was now stripped bare, robbed not only of his possessions but of his dignity. He fought to keep his composure, even as pain and anger churned within him. But in that moment, one thought burned brighter than the flames devouring his car. He would not let this stand. They might think they'd won tonight, but they hadn't seen the last of him. Not by a long shot. As the officers turned and sauntered back to their vehicle, one of them glanced back, chuckling. "Next time, know your place, Sheriff." With that, they drove off, leaving Turner standing alone in the dark, smoke billowing from the remains of his car, the acrid smell of burnt metal and plastic filling the air. The night was silent once again, save for the crackling of the dying flames. Turner felt the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him, but he forced himself to stand tall, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the town. Bruised, battered, and stripped of everything he valued, Turner knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Turner stood in the darkness, the stillness settling around him as he took in the destruction of his car, his symbol of pride, now reduced to a smoldering ruin. Every breath he took sent a sharp pain through his ribs, and his legs felt as if they could buckle at any moment. But he knew he couldn't stay there, stranded and vulnerable on this deserted stretch of road. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to take a step, the gravel crunching underfoot. Each movement ignited a fresh wave of pain, reminding him of the beating he'd just endured. His thoughts spun, the harsh reality sinking in. He had been left for dead by his own men. Men who were supposed to uphold the same values, the same justice, he had dedicated his life to. But Turner wasn't about to give in to despair. He focused on each step, moving forward even though each breath felt like fire in his lungs. There was no one to call, no one to lean on. Only himself. A quiet determination began to build, rising against the pain. This wasn't how his story was going to end. Every step he took toward town was a reminder. He was stronger than they'd ever know. With each labored step, Turner fought back the waves of anger and betrayal threatening to overwhelm him. He couldn't afford to fall into that darkness, not now. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the town, the people who trusted him, who counted on him. And though the night stretched out endlessly, every inch of it felt like a test he was determined to pass. As Turner continued his slow, painful march, the silence around him became a breeding ground for thoughts he'd tried to push aside. With each step, memories of the officers' mocking faces, their cold disregard, flashed through his mind. How could they have done this? Men who'd sworn the same oath, men who'd supposedly shared his commitment to justice. Turner had dedicated his life to upholding the law, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But now, that same badge, that same code, had been twisted, used as a weapon against him. The thought of it was nearly unbearable. He'd faced prejudice before, yes, but never had it struck so close to home. Those officers didn't just disregard his authority, they dismissed his humanity. And what hurt more than the bruises or the pain in his ribs was the realization that they'd felt empowered to do so. To them, his title meant nothing. His years of service, his dedication, they saw past all of it. All they saw was someone they thought they could step on without consequence. "Is this justice?" he found himself whispering, the question hanging in the night air, a bitter echo of everything he believed in. Had he been wrong to place so much faith in the system? Had he, in his quest to serve and protect, underestimated the power of deeply ingrained prejudice? Yet, even as doubt clouded his mind, Turner felt a flicker of defiance ignite. He knew what real justice looked like. Justice wasn't about titles or who wielded power. It was about integrity, about standing firm when the world tested you. Those men thought they'd stripped him of his authority, of his dignity, but true authority came from within. It came from knowing who he was, even when others tried to tear him down. With every painful step, Turner reminded himself of the people he'd helped, the lives he'd changed. Those were the real marks of his legacy, not a title or a badge. And he knew he couldn't let the actions of two corrupt men erase a lifetime of service. As hurt and betrayed as he felt, Turner realized that his belief in justice was stronger than their hate. The town lights flickered faintly in the distance, a glimmer of hope through the darkness. He straightened, his resolve solidifying. They had tried to make him feel small, powerless. But as long as he was standing, as long as he could take one more step, Turner knew he had the strength to prove them wrong. As Turner trudged forward, his body aching and worn, he drew strength from somewhere deep within. The pain was overwhelming, every step felt like a mountain to climb, but he wasn't about to let this be his final chapter. His thoughts circled back to all the battles he'd fought, all the obstacles he'd overcome. He wasn't just walking back to town, he was fighting his way back to himself, to everything he stood for. The town lights grew nearer, barely visible through the night's haze. Each time he stumbled, he gritted his teeth, refusing to let the memory of those officers' sneers and taunts hold him down. This wasn't about vengeance, he reminded himself, nor was it just about his own pride. This was about something far bigger, a chance to stand for what was right, to ensure that no one else would face the kind of betrayal he'd endured tonight. Lakeside deserved better, and so did he. The physical pain pulsed with every step, but it seemed small in comparison to the fire burning within him. Turner wasn't alone on this road. He carried with him the hopes of everyone who believed in fairness, in decency, and in courage. And he knew that when he returned, he'd make sure this town saw justice served, not just for himself, but for the very soul of Lakeside. No one was above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. A gust of wind blew through the trees, a cold reminder of the long journey still ahead, but it only fueled Turner's determination. He thought of the people in Lakeside, the families, the young kids who looked up to him, the elders who had thanked him over the years for his service. They were counting on him, and he couldn't let them down. To give up now would be to let down every person who'd ever believed in him, every person who'd ever looked to him for protection. As the town limits approached, Turner felt a surge of renewed energy. This was his home, his community, and he would defend it with everything he had. Those men had tried to take his dignity, his resolve, even his hope, but they hadn't succeeded. His bruises would heal, his car could be replaced, but his spirit was unbreakable. The weight of his badge, the responsibility it carried, meant more to him now than ever before. The streetlights finally came into view, casting a faint glow over the empty roads leading to the station. Turner straightened his back, ignoring the stabbing pain in his ribs and the weariness in his limbs. He'd come this far, and he would see it through. They might have tried to leave him behind, to bury him in fear and doubt, but Turner was still standing. As he took those last steps toward town, a quiet but fierce determination filled him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure that justice was served, that accountability remained intact, and that no one, not even a person in uniform, would ever feel they were above the law. Finally reaching the outskirts of town, Turner's heart steadied as he caught sight of the familiar streets. The adrenaline from the night's events still pumped through his veins, but now, it was tempered by a clear resolve. Each step toward the station reminded him of the duty he had, not just to himself, but to every person in Lakeside who believed in him. Tonight, he'd been betrayed, humiliated, but he was still standing, and he intended to see justice through. The streetlights illuminated the path to the station, casting long shadows over his battered form. He felt each bruise, every ache from his broken body, but his spirit remained intact. As he entered the police station lobby, he could feel the collective stares from the few officers working the night shift. Eyes widened in shock as they took in the dirt, the torn uniform, and the unmistakable look of determination in his gaze. They knew something had gone terribly wrong, and they sensed that Turner wasn't going to let it go easily. One officer, young and visibly shaken, stepped forward. "Sheriff, what happened?" His voice wavered as he took in Turner's injuries. "Gather every senior officer on duty," Turner replied, his tone steady and commanding. "We have 2 men who've crossed every line, and it's time they're brought to justice." He didn't need to explain further. His unyielding expression told them everything they needed to know. As word spread, the station's once quiet halls became a flurry of movement. Officers assembled, their faces marked with concern, respect, and a fierce loyalty. They knew Turner was a man of integrity, someone who had always placed the community above everything. And now, seeing him like this, they understood the gravity of the betrayal he'd faced. Inside the briefing room, Turner gathered his senior officers around a large table, his voice unwavering as he recounted the events of the night. Every detail, the reckless driving, the cold contempt, the physical assault, and finally the destruction of his car, painted a picture of betrayal and hatred that went beyond mere insubordination. By the time he'd finished, the room was silent, his officers stunned by the audacity of the men who'd attacked him. These men, Jameson and Clark, thought they could do whatever they wanted, that they were untouchable, Turner said, his voice low but filled with steely resolve. They believed that a badge gave them power over others. They forgot that the badge is a symbol of service, not domination. One of the senior officers, Lieutenant Rhodes, spoke up, his voice thick with anger. "What do you need us to do, Sheriff?" Turner took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night press on his shoulders, but he refused to let it break him. "We're going to bring them in," he replied, his tone clear. "I want every available unit on this. These men will be found, and they will answer for what they've done." A murmur of agreement swept through the room. His officers knew the risks, but Turner had always led them with honor, and tonight, they would stand by him. "Make no mistake," Turner continued, his gaze sweeping across the faces of those who'd pledged loyalty to Lakeside. "They left me on that road, believing they could silence me, strip me of my dignity. But they underestimated the strength of this badge and the unity of this department." The officers nodded in solidarity, a sense of purpose filling the air. They were more than ready to stand behind him, not out of fear, but out of respect for the man who had shown them what justice truly meant. Outside the briefing room, Turner watched his team mobilize with a renewed sense of energy. His pain was ever present, but it no longer consumed him. What filled him now was the knowledge that he wasn't alone in this fight. He had a department willing to uphold the very principles they'd sworn to protect, a town that trusted him to lead, and a deep conviction that justice would prevail. As he stepped back into his office, he looked at the broken fragments of his own reflection in the glass, a man bruised, beaten, but unbroken. He knew this night had left scars, some that would remain long after the physical wounds healed. But those scars would serve as a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, one could choose to stand tall. Tonight Turner had lost much, but he'd gained something even more powerful. A renewed commitment to the principles that had led him to serve in the first place. Turner sat in the passenger seat of the patrol car, the night air thick with tension as they neared the location where they'd last seen Jameson and Clark. His body still ached from the night's events, but his mind was clear, focused entirely on the task at hand. Every officer had been briefed. They all understood what was at stake. Tonight wasn't just about arresting 2 men. It was about restoring the integrity of the badge they all wore. It was about justice. The radio crackled to life. "We've spotted a car matching the description, Sheriff," came the voice from one of the units stationed along Quarry Road, near an isolated, wooded area. "It's parked, lights off. No movement inside, but they're here." Turner felt a surge of adrenaline. He gripped the dashboard as his car pulled up to the scene, his jaw set with determination. As the officers gathered, Turner gave a nod. "Stay sharp," he reminded them, his voice low but steady. "They know we're closing in, and there's no telling what they'll try next." The team moved in quietly, spreading out to cover the exits, ensuring there was no escape. With each step, the gravity of the night weighed on Turner, but he kept his focus sharp. He wasn't here for vengeance, he was here to make things right, for himself, for Lakeside, and for the principles he'd sworn to uphold. As they neared the vehicle, a movement inside confirmed their target. Jameson and Clark sat in the front seats, heads bowed, as if in deep, hushed conversation. The realization that their actions had consequences seemed to dawn on them, but it was too late to run. Turner stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, casting harsh shadows over the men's faces as they looked up. Both men's expressions twisted from surprise to thinly veiled contempt. They had nowhere to go, yet there was a cold defiance in their eyes, as though they still believed they could walk away unscathed. "Jameson, Clark," Turner addressed them, his voice cold and unyielding. "Step out of the vehicle now." Jameson sneered, the same smugness from earlier in the night flickering in his eyes. But he knew he was cornered, and after a tense pause he opened the car door, stepping out slowly, his hands raised slightly, more out of mockery than surrender. Clark followed suit, glancing at Turner with a look of barely concealed disdain. "What's this, Sheriff?" Jameson taunted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Finally figured out you can't win?" Turner held his gaze, his face impassive. "You thought you could get away with it," he replied, his voice measured, every word resonating with authority. "But you crossed a line tonight. This badge," he touched the emblem on his chest, "is a symbol of trust, of justice, not power or control." Clark scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Justice? Don't act so righteous. You know nothing about what it takes to keep control." Turner took a step closer, meeting Clark's gaze head-on. "Control isn't the same as justice. And when you choose control over duty, you corrupt everything we stand for." He glanced around at the officers surrounding them, men and women who shared his commitment to integrity. "These people, the ones who wear this badge, don't take that lightly." Jameson and Clark's expressions hardened, realizing they were outmatched, not just in numbers, but in principle. Turner motioned to his team, giving a subtle nod. It was time. Two officers stepped forward, each gripping one of the men by the arms, their faces impassive as they placed handcuffs on Jameson and Clark. The metal clicked shut, the sound punctuating the silence, a final statement of their betrayal. As the cuffs clicked shut, Turner stepped back, letting the weight of the moment sink in. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a reckoning. He looked at Jameson and Clark, noting the defiance in their eyes falter as the realization of what lay ahead began to set in. For a moment, he saw a flicker of something that looked like fear, or perhaps shame. But Turner didn't waver. He gestured to his officers, and they began to search the vehicle. The trunk, as expected, was filled with items meant to cover their tracks: a change of clothes, a backup set of license plates, and an open map with routes marked, indicating a hastily planned escape. Clearly, they'd known there was a chance they'd be caught, but they'd underestimated the unity of a department dedicated to justice. Turner couldn't help but feel a bittersweet sense of triumph. He'd faced down not only two corrupt men but the doubts that had lingered in his own mind after such a betrayal. This victory wasn't just his. It was a reminder to every officer there that they stood for something greater. Turner stood before his team, the night air thick with an unspoken tension. In the middle of the clearing, Jameson and Clark, now handcuffed and stripped of their badges, stood under the unwavering gaze of the officers they had betrayed. For years, Turner had believed that wearing a badge meant upholding values like courage, honesty, and loyalty. But tonight he saw that to some, the badge had become a tool for power, and for these two men, it was a shield they thought would protect them from justice. "This is where it ends," Turner said, his voice cutting through the darkness. "You both took an oath, to serve, to protect, to uphold the law. But instead, you chose to break that oath, to betray the trust this community placed in you and every one of us. You thought the badge would keep you safe, that no one would dare stand against you. But you were wrong. The very badge you hid behind is the one that's going to bring you to justice." Jameson's expression, which had once been smug and full of defiance, now cracked slightly. A flicker of fear or perhaps shame crossed his face, but it quickly disappeared as he tried to steel himself. Clark, however, let out a dry, bitter laugh, still clinging to his sense of superiority. "You think you're so noble, Turner? You think the badge means anything in the real world? We did what had to be done, kept control where you refused to." Turner didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his voice lowering as he stared Clark down. "Control?" he said, his voice thick with disgust. "The badge was never about control. It was about service, service to the people, not to yourself. You turned that symbol of trust into a weapon for your own gain, and tonight, you're going to answer for it." He turned to his assembled officers, who stood watching in silence, their faces filled with a mixture of anger and solemn pride. Every single one of them had felt the sting of betrayal, and now, seeing their leader stand firm, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. Turner could see it in their eyes. This wasn't just about him. It was about every officer who wore the badge with honor, every citizen who deserved protection, and every young cadet who looked up to the department as a symbol of justice. With a firm nod, Turner gestured to two of his most trusted officers, who stepped forward to take Jameson and Clark by the arms. As they began to lead the men away, Turner stopped them with one last command. "Wait." He walked over to where Jameson and Clark stood, his gaze unyielding. He reached forward and pulled their badges from their uniforms, one by one. Holding the badges up in front of the gathered officers, he spoke loudly enough for every person in the clearing to hear. "This badge is a privilege, earned through service and sacrifice. It's not a shield to hide your crimes behind. From this moment, you're stripped of that privilege, stripped of every honor and duty that comes with it." He dropped the badges to the ground, watching as they hit the dirt, a silent yet powerful symbol of their disgrace. The finality of that moment was undeniable, the badges lying in the dirt, discarded symbols of trust betrayed. For a second, there was silence, a heavy, meaningful pause that seemed to echo in the minds of everyone present. Jameson looked away, his shoulders slumping in defeat, his bravado finally breaking as the weight of his actions settled over him. Clark, however, continued to hold Turner's gaze, his eyes flashing with anger, but the defiance was hollow now. He knew, as did everyone else, that the power he had once wielded was gone. Turner had stripped it away, piece by piece, leaving them both with nothing but the consequences of their choices. "Take them away," Turner ordered, his voice calm but firm. The officers nodded, leading Jameson and Clark toward the waiting patrol cars. The remaining officers watched as they were escorted off the field, their figures disappearing into the night. For Turner, this was more than just an arrest. It was a stand, a message to every person who wore the badge and to the entire community. As the patrol cars pulled away with Jameson and Clark in the back, Turner took a moment to gather himself, feeling the weight of the night settle into his bones. The officers around him watched with a mixture of respect and quiet admiration. Tonight had been a brutal reminder that even within their ranks, corruption could fester. But as they stood under the dim glow of the street lights, Turner knew it was also a night to reaffirm what they all stood for. He turned to face his team, the men and women who had shown unwavering loyalty and a commitment to integrity. "What happened here tonight?" he began, his voice carrying the strength of a leader but the weariness of someone who had faced betrayal. "Was a violation of everything this badge stands for. But it's also a reminder. A reminder that justice is not a weapon to be wielded at will. It's a responsibility, a duty to serve, and a promise we keep to each person who trusts us to protect them." The officers nodded, their faces resolute, feeling the weight of Turner's words. He took a deep breath, letting the night's chill solidify his resolve. There will always be those who think the badge is a symbol of power," he continued. "People who believe it gives them the right to control, to take, to hurt. But let tonight serve as a warning to anyone who tries to twist that responsibility." Turner paused, letting his gaze sweep over the officers, making sure his words sank in. Jameson and Clark thought they could act above the law. But no one is above the law. Not you, not me, and certainly not them. The minute we let power take the place of service, we've failed the very people we swore to protect. And I won't allow that. The silence hung heavy, but it was filled with an unspoken resolve, a sense of purpose that bound them all together. Turner saw in their faces that this was more than just a victory over corruption. It was a moment that would shape their department, remind each of them why they wore the badge. And in that shared understanding, Turner felt a surge of hope for what was to come. "This badge," he continued, placing a hand over his own, "isn't just a symbol. It's a commitment to justice, to fairness, and to each other. When we wear it, we carry the trust of the community. And if any of us ever forget that, if any of us ever think we're above it, then we don't deserve to wear it at all." He let his words settle, feeling the weight of the oath they all had taken. Tonight had been a dark chapter, but it was also a turning point, a chance to recommit to the ideals that had brought each of them to this place. Turner knew that for every Jameson and Clark, there were 10 others who believed in honor, who wore the badge with pride and respect. And that was worth fighting for. As he looked around, Turner could see his words had resonated deeply. His officers stood a little straighter, their faces marked by a renewed determination, a sense of solidarity. Tonight they hadn't just preserved justice, they had strengthened their bond as a team. The betrayal of two had reminded them all of the principles that bound them together. "This town needs to trust us," Turner said, his voice softening but no less firm. "And we need to trust each other. We may have lost two tonight, but we've gained something stronger, an unbreakable commitment to what's right." The officers nodded in agreement, a sense of unity solidifying among them. Turner knew that as long as they held on to that, as long as they remembered the meaning behind the badge, Lakeside would always be a place where justice prevailed. As the last of his team dispersed, and the quiet of the night returned, Turner found himself alone, surrounded by the stillness of the empty lot. The events of the night replayed in his mind, each moment pressing heavily on his heart. He'd witnessed corruption from those he thought he could trust, a betrayal that had shaken him to the core. Yet, more than anything, he felt the weight of his own responsibility. Turner knew that as sheriff, the standard he set didn't end with enforcing the law, it extended to the very integrity of those who upheld it. He took a deep breath, feeling both pride and sadness. This night had served as a harsh reminder that leadership required more than just a title. It demanded vigilance, honesty, and sometimes the courage to confront those within his own ranks. Turner couldn't help but wonder if there had been warning signs he had missed, small indicators of a problem simmering beneath the surface. In the quiet of that moment, he made a silent promise to himself, to hold not only his officers accountable, but to hold himself to that same high standard. He couldn't change what had happened tonight, but he could learn from it. Turner knew that this was a chance to reflect on his role, to remember why he'd taken the oath to serve in the first place. With the weight of the night's events still pressing on him, Turner walked back to the station, his mind set on the steps that lay ahead. The betrayal had left scars, not just on him, but on the whole department, and most importantly, on the community's trust. Turner knew that if he wanted to rebuild that trust, words alone wouldn't be enough. Actions had to follow. The following morning, Turner gathered his officers for an urgent meeting. As they assembled in the briefing room, he saw the weariness in their faces, the silent acknowledgement of what they'd endured together. But he also saw determination, a willingness to take responsibility and make things right. This was his chance to reshape the department into something stronger, something more honorable than before. He began, his tone measured but firm. "Last night was a wake-up call. It showed us that we can't afford to be complacent. If we're going to serve this community with the respect it deserves, we need to make sure we're all on the same page, now and going forward." His gaze swept across the room, each officer listening intently. "From this day on, we're implementing new standards, new practices to make sure no one is ever put in a position to abuse their power." Turner then outlined a series of reforms aimed at transparency, ethics training, and accountability. He spoke of plans to establish regular reviews and anonymous reporting systems, tools to make sure no concern would go unheard, no abuse left unchecked. These changes, he emphasized, weren't just about preventing another incident like the one they'd faced. They were about holding every officer, including himself, to the highest standards of integrity and respect. "This is more than a policy change," he said, his voice firm. "It's a commitment. We're going to earn back this town's trust, brick by brick, day by day." The room was silent, but he could feel the shared sense of purpose, the quiet resolve from each officer as they absorbed his words. Turner knew that true reform wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that if they stayed committed to these principles, they could build something better, something lasting. By the end of the meeting, the department was no longer just a group of individuals. It was a team united by the promise to protect and serve with honor. And Turner felt a renewed hope, knowing that from this moment on, they would work together to rebuild and strengthen the foundation of trust that had once held them all together. As the last of his officers left the room, Turner lingered, letting the silence settle around him. The empty chairs, the stillness, all seemed to echo the lessons of the night before. The department, the badge, none of it was about power, or control, or ego. It was about trust, about protecting the community with humility and unwavering integrity. Turner realized that justice wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a commitment that demanded his best each and every day. He stepped out of the station, feeling the early morning sun warm his face. Lakeside was waking up, unaware of the events that had unfolded during the night. As he looked out at the quiet streets, he thought about every citizen who lived there, the families, the children playing in their yards, the elderly who felt safe knowing their sheriff was looking out for them. These were the people he served, the ones who deserved the kind of law enforcement that honored the badge and the oath behind it. Turner felt a deep sense of responsibility settle within him. If this department was going to move forward, if they were truly going to rebuild trust, it would have to start with him and his unwavering dedication to justice. Every step he took, every decision he made, would serve as an example. And he hoped that example would inspire his officers to hold themselves to that same high standard. He thought of Jameson and Clark, now stripped of the badge they had disgraced. It would be easy to dwell on anger, to feel betrayed, but Turner knew he couldn't let bitterness define him. Instead, he felt a quiet resolve to make sure their actions would be a reminder to every officer about the weight of their responsibility. The power given to them wasn't a privilege to be taken lightly. It was a trust, one that had to be earned every day. With a deep breath, Turner looked toward the horizon, the town stretching out before him. This was his home, a place worth fighting for, worth protecting with every ounce of his strength. He knew the path forward wouldn't be easy. Mistakes would be made, challenges would arise, but as long as he kept his commitment to truth and integrity, he knew he was on the right path. In that moment, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey as sheriff wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about upholding a higher standard of humanity, compassion, and accountability. He would make sure that every person, every officer, and every citizen knew that justice in Lakeside meant something real, something they could believe in. With a final, quiet nod, Turner turned back toward the station, ready to lead his team toward a brighter, more honorable future. The road ahead was long, but with every step, he would carry the lessons of this night, and the deep, unshakable belief that justice, true justice, was always worth fighting for. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, integrity, and justice.